Hi, I'm Tim with Jack Forster and Brian Govberg. Welcome to Watchbox. This is Perpetually Patek. Today we're going to share some of our memories of our time in the watch industry, and these two veterans are going to illuminate the experience of following Patek Philippe since the 1990s. Jack, what was the first major milestone that you experienced with the Patek brand as a member of the watch media?
I think probably my first major memory of Patek Philippe was just discovering the brand and discovering what it represented. So you go back to the late 1990s. Back in those days, there was barely a watch internet, and the magazines, such as they were on the newsstands next to the model railroading and the doll collecting magazines. So it was harder to acquire knowledge, a lot harder to acquire knowledge back then than it was now. And the forums, which back in the early days meant Usenet newsgroups, timezone.com, and thepurists.com. These were places where there was a lot of focus on relatively newer things because the forums themselves were new, the technology was new, and there was a lot of respect given to legacy brands. And it took a little while for it to sink in for me just what Patek Philippe actually represented. And I spent, the first few years that I was a serious watch enthusiast kind of wondering what the big deal was. But what Patek Philippe has done, and I think uniquely really, is it's built a reputation that is based on the production of simply the finest quality watches that can be made in the Swiss French, in the Genevan idiom. And like I said, it took a little while for that to sink in. And I remember one of the very first watch reviews I ever participated in was a review of the 3919. Calatrava, and I remember thinking to myself, well, I just don't get it. What's the big deal? It's a small, thin watch with it, they couldn't even be bothered, with center seconds on the damn thing. I warmed up to it.
No, I think the world warmed up to it. Of course, the 3919 coming out in 1985, it was sort of a comeback watch for Patek in the wristwatch market, because a lot of folks who were interested in high-end Patek Philippe and the vintage scene in the early 80s were more interested in pocket watches. So to reintroduce the brand, so to speak, to a younger generation, the 3919 was a big part of that commercial push. It was small, it was simple, it was a solid caseback, it was manual wind, but it was the Patek it watch of the late 80s and early 90s.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And which is not to say that the elevated reputation that Patek Philippe enjoyed was not largely due to its reputation as a manufacturer of complicated watches. In the late 1990s, of course, everybody still remembered the Caliber 89. At that point, it was still the most complicated watch that anyone had ever made, even with a kind of sort of date of Easter. And Patek's reputation as a maker of complicated watches in general and minute repeaters in particular, I think, was something that was certainly a source of sustained interest for me. Although I didn't actually get a chance to hear a Patek Philippe minute repeater in person until much, much later, almost a decade later.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So the Aquanaut, you're a great Aquanaut enthusiast, and although you weren't around as part of the industry in 1997, the Aquanauts really helped to define your collection through the years. We've got an incredible one on the table, I think, am I wrong? But you've got your own personal on the wrist. Talk a little bit about what that meant in the late 1990s, because you followed the whole history of that model line.
Yeah, the Aquanaut, I think, really grew out of trying to create a different design perspective than the Nautilus, right? The Nautilus was never really meant to be a sport watch. It was meant to be a upmarket steel integrated bracelet watch, and the Aquanaut's focus was to be that sport watch. And the design cues grew out of the Nautilus case. We've talked about some transition pieces on the show before that were actually classified as a Nautilus, but were technically, if you would look at them now, you would have called it an Aquanaut. And so the watches themselves have changed over time. They started as much smaller than they are today, the original launch size being 36 millimeters, and then today they're as large as 42 millimeters. And so the watches themselves have changed over time. When they first launched, I would say desirability was not what it is now. Again, no different than when the Nautiluses were first launched. They weren't as desirable as they are now. The brand prided itself, no different than Jack said, on these old school, more traditional aesthetics. And it wasn't until the modern era that tastes have really changed. I brought on the table here a 5066 1J, which is one of the original yellow gold Aquanauts on an integrated bracelet. To be honest, I had no reason to bring the watch on the show outside of, as I was picking these pieces out, I just thought it was too cool not to bring.
Well, the show is called Perpetually Patek.
Exactly.
This is in fact a Patek.
Exactly. It is in fact a Patek.
But it's not perpetual.
Oh, it is not perpetual. But it patinaed like beautifully. And so I just thought the watch was just, remarkable in terms of its heft, its design, how thick the bracelet is relative to the size of the case, and it's just not something you see being produced today.
I mean, I think it's an extremely beautiful watch, actually, and I do think that this example is a pretty relevant one in terms of how Patek presents itself to the public and how it sees itself has kind of changed over the years. I mean, when was this watch made?
Oh, it came out in 1998.
1998, right. So, I mean, by today's standards, it's a relatively small watch. I'm hesitant to use the word dainty, but it's like kind of a dainty watch.
Yeah.
It feels very dressy. It definitely doesn't feel like a sports watch. And, I'm not sure how it landed to Patek Philippe enthusiasts back when it was launched, but, certainly right now it looks like, a slightly old-fashioned watch that is definitely, of its era, and not necessarily something that Patek would produce today.
I will say this, though. There was a thrust to go more mainstream at Patek in the 80s and 90s. The 3919 back in 1985, it seems incredibly quaint by our standards, but it was considered to be a young man's watch, primarily because it was a wristwatch and not a pocket watch. But in the 90s, Patek moved in a direction towards vastly increased use of complications, but also watches for larger volume audiences, such as the Aquanaut in 1997, which came out with its rubber strap, a lower price point, a steel case, and 2 years later, the Ladies 24, which combined steel with quartz and diamonds to create a much higher volume timepiece that would eventually, the 4910 reference, become the single best-selling Patek Philippe market. So we see this progression from the 80s through the 90s as Patek goes from being sort of the ultimate old money luxury brand to something that's a little bit more democratized, if not in terms of price, certainly in terms of appeal.
So another, I would say, for me, the backdrop, 2009, 2010, 2011, just coming into this industry, the brand was going through a big transition in that they were discontinuing a lot of the non-in-house movements in favor of what was it took over the industry. We were talking about this a little bit before the episode about how sort of the defining characteristic of a brand was, were your movements in-house or were they not? And in 2010, you had the 5170J here, which transitioned to their first in-house column wheel chronograph. And then you had, in 2011, the Perpetual Calendar Chronograph was launched, and it was their first in-house Perpetual Calendar Chrono. And for me, I didn't quite appreciate how big a foundational change this was for the brand at the time, but now I have just a much greater respect for how big a transition this was.
Yeah, I mean, I think every generation, I have a couple of theories about this. I mean, I think every generation of watch enthusiasts has kind of its thing that it latches onto as an easy to understand dividing line between what's inherently qualitatively superior and what's inherently qualitatively inferior, right? So, and for the longest time it was in-house, and I think that we still are seeing kind of hangovers of that today. I mean, whether or not it actually makes a difference to the craftsmanship of the watch, the quality of the watch, and to its inherent horological value, it still matters to a certain extent, whether or not a movement is in-house. But of course, as we all know, for most of the history of Swiss watchmaking, whether or not a movement was in-house was really a secondary consideration. Mm-hmm. I mean, and the whole distributed manufacturing network that existed in Switzerland and still exists in Switzerland kind of plays against the idea of in-house as something that's, inherently important. But, when Lange came out with its first collection in the 1990s, I mean, it was all quote-unquote in-house movements, and that was certainly something that the new Lange enthusiasts like to throw in the teeth of Patek enthusiasts.
Although AP enthusiasts will remind you that APRP was largely responsible for the Porte-Marie tourbillon. Yeah. But it's good you mentioned Lange, because that is a bit of a watershed moment for the industry. Not so much the initial collection in 1994, but the Dotograph in 1999. If you look at what happened the year before, the 5070 came out, and that probably would be remembered as the greatest chronograph of the 1990s, if not for the fact that a landmark watch came out the very next year with a better match between case size and movement size, a more elaborately finished movement, a movement made entirely in-house by a brand that was 5 years old, or had only been making watches for 5 years. And while the 5070 is a design triumph, it was not mechanically ambitious. And I would even go so far as to say the level of finishing and execution, while it was handsome and traditional, it wasn't Baroque or Rococo to the level of the Lunga. And so Patek looked at that moment, the Dotograph in '99, and said, the future for us has to be a higher level of finish on our high-end chronographs, and it has to be something we make ourselves.
But I would just say as a caveat, a more visibly obvious high-end level of finish, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you know,
And depth to the movement.
Yeah, and this is getting back a little bit to what I was saying before about every generation of watch enthusiasts kind of having their own hang-ups. Like people are starting to rediscover movement finishing now, and you go on Instagram, and what a lot of watch enthusiasts are kind of drooling over is taking macro. I mean, something's never changed. Taking macro pictures of what they think are beautiful movements, and posting these beautiful pictures.
I didn't realize this was a trend.
It's a little
And then
bit-
what, they get chewed out?
Well, and then they get chewed out, or like the thing that people are obsessed with now is sharp inner angles, right? Like, does a movement have sharp inner angles in its finishing? And I mean, some movements have more than others, for sure. Some of them are definitely executed by hand, for sure. We're getting to a point now where it's very difficult to distinguish between the diamond cut sharp inner angle and and one that's done by hand. But I mean, I'm beginning to wonder whether that simple hermeneutic for deciding whether or not a movement is well finished isn't as overblown in its own way as the whole in-house, not in-house debate.
And so I think one of the things that I find is that they rose to the challenge, but they continue to evolve. And one of the things that I would say about Lunga is that a lot of their benchmark watches that they launched, no different than the Dotograph in 1999, is that they have not evolved to the same level that many other brands have done in order to both change in scale and with the times and perhaps in the design cues, and that they're still maybe resting on the laurels of that watch. Versus Patek, again, another watch here on the table, we have the Pilot's Watch 5524. And we were speaking about how just divisive this watch was, and more because when it launched, it was not necessarily Patek's first pilot watch, but the first pilot watch of this generation. And for the newer collector, it checked a lot of boxes, right? It was a little bit larger. It was a strap watch. It could be worn more casually or for dress. And so it was that first watch that perhaps offered something different than an Aquanaut or a Nautilus. But for a lot of the sort of core collector, the traditional collector, the collector that still felt the brand was rooted in, let's say, the 5170J here, they didn't fully understand it, right? Or they thought that Patek was going in perhaps a direction that they disagreed with.
Or they understood, they just didn't like it.
Correct. And they were going in a direction that they didn't agree with, maybe that as if the brand was following a trend. And if anything, I think that it was at this point that we really see that the foundation was set for where the brand is today, right? Because you have this the divide between sport and dress has decreased tremendously.
Yeah.
And some of the best performing watches today that are strap watches really got their design cues or the direction from this watch.
It's weird though, I mean, I was at Basel World when this watch launched back when dinosaurs ruled the earth, and I mean, some of the collectors I talked to were absolutely livid. They were like, "What is Patek doing? This is absolutely ridiculous. It has nothing to do with Patek Philippe." The comparison that I heard was not to early generations of pilot watches or pocket watches, where this was kind of a radical departure for Patek Philippe for a wristwatch, sure, but these hands and this particular dial arrangement have been around since about 1910. Everybody was making negative comparisons between Patek Philippe and Zenith, but the truth is Zenith was the negative point of comparison just because they were the ones who happened to be doing the most with vintage-style pocket watch hands and vintage-style pocket watch dials. It was not, I think that imitating the commercial success of Zenith's oversized pilot's watches was probably the furthest thing from the Stearns minds when they launched this watch. At first glance, it's a much more utilitarian watch than it actually is, and it's as if you took every single element of sort of a classic aviator's watch, a classic pilot's watch, but you turned the level of execution up to 11, and this is what you would get.
It is a wonderful piece because it's proven to be remarkably versatile. They came out with a rose gold version 3 years later. They came out with a 37.5mm version that they initially billed as a ladies' watch, but then decided that was a great size for a men's complication. So now they just call the 7234 the mid-size. They did eventually come out with an example in stainless steel, but only as a special edition for a local grand exhibition that they pulled off. So the watch has evolved well, and it has always maintained its foot on each side of the fracture or the fault line between the dress category and the sports category. And it really is the only Calatrava I can think of off the top of my head that could be described as a sports watch.
For sure.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so moving into the modern era now, this, of course, is a 2015 release. It's been updated many times since. But I would say that it's interesting to see how Patek Philippe has navigated the star power, the late-breaking star power of the Nautilus and the Aquanaut. And one way they've done that in the last couple of years has been to emphasize steel on watches that are not explicitly sports watches. The 5905 in steel, the 5212 weekly calendar in steel, the 6007 limited edition. All of these pieces have been introducing more steel to the collection as Patek has tried to wean itself off maybe its mind share dependency on the sports watches.
At the same time, the direction that the company is going has been like this watch was part of a larger conversation that was going on internally at Patek at the time. I think about really where are we going to go? You know, I mean, we can't just be a binary company anymore where we do steel sports watches in the Aquanaut and we do round gold watches, and there's a clear dividing line between the two, right? There's a clear dividing line between the Nautilus and the Aquanaut and the rest of the round watches, which are round, precious metal, often complicated. Like there's a middle ground there. I mean, if I were a fly on the wall, I would suspect that there was a conversation about there being a middle ground there that was being ignored, where you have watches that kind of represent some of the classic Patek Philippe DNA and some of its classic orientation towards complicated watchmaking, but that are more wearable, that seem less formal, that don't look like something that the gents would discuss after dinner in the library over cigars and brandy while the ladies are busy doing something else.
No, and it continues with watches like the 5326, which is an annual calendar and a dual time, and the 5226, which is at face value just a simple dress watch. Those are not dress watches in the vein of like the 5120 or even today's 6119. They're very versatile timepieces. They are one-watch proposals for people who want to wear a watch all the time, and I do think that they are viable alternatives for the person who maybe would have liked the idea of what the Nautilus was 5, 6, 7 years ago, but now maybe is put off a little bit by all of the pop culture baggage and the considerable expense associated with getting one. So Patek is broadening its options for all the time use. It's just not doing it with sports watches.
No, and we've talked about this on episodes prior, where the collector of today wants to feel, I would say, more cohesiveness in terms of what they're purchasing, and not feel perhaps that they're purchasing a watch from a completely different generation. And so whether it's the 5226, which has that blackish gray texture dial,
And it's smoked, too.
And it's smoked. It's a more casual dress watch that can be, I would say, dressed up, dressed down, and perhaps it serves as a complement to modern day sports watches. But we were talking about before the episode where everything that's happening now and everything that happened with the Aquanaut and the Nautilus in terms of its popularity was built upon this foundation of what came before it, that the brand would always produce to the highest level of quality and would never produce a down watch. And that foundation is what led to the overall success of the Aquanaut and Nautilus. And then that obviously has changed the trajectory and the scale and the notoriety of the brand today.
I mean, in a certain way, you could say that this watch does for white gold what the original Nautilus did for steel, right? I mean, just sort of like working the problem from the other direction. I mean, the three. What are the three classic hype watches is a little bit of an oxymoron, but like, what are the three hype watches of the last 5 years? There's the Nautilus, the Royal Oak, and stainless steel Daytona, right? And none of those are Johnny-come-latelys. Those are all watches with very, very deep roots in the history of the companies that made them. 2 out of 3 of them were initially sold on the basis of being absurdly, inexplicably expensive for steel watches.
Correct.
Right?
They were advertised as such.
Yeah, exactly. And to do what Patek Philippe did with a steel sports watch, in the 1970s was obviously a revolutionary decision. But the desire to create something that is disruptive to its own internal traditions is something I think Patek is leaning into more now, I think, than maybe ever in the last, or at least in the last 50 years. And I think that it's leading them in some interesting directions because you have to evolve. You have to change. People would. I think Thierry Stern is right. I don't think people would have purchased 5711s in steel. I don't think they would have purchased them indefinitely. And sooner or later, you have to direct people's attention back to the other things that the brand is doing.
And the clientele has changed.
Right.
Right? You have a very different mix of consumer now that are coming into the brand or any watch brand, right? They're younger, they come from different backgrounds. And so I think that you have to cater to this new breed of collector that wants something a little bit different. They perhaps want a different watch than a smaller size, yellow gold, retrograde perpetual calendar. And
Right.
so, and you now have these design cues where a much younger collector and perhaps a much older collector are liking similar things, right? And that's where a lot of these references that are coming out today, whether it's the new salmon dial World Time Chrono, right? It's a little bit bigger, it's in steel, it has a salmon dial, and so traditional, let's call it perhaps traditional movement, right? So still a strap watch, but modern day things that would make the watch more popular, steel case, salmon dial,
Yeah.
slightly more modern in terms of approach. And so they're holding true to their roots, but producing a watch that's relevant now.
So here's a question for both of you. As we all know, vintage Cartier is having a moment. When you think of Cartier, you think of design primarily. You don't necessarily think of the creation of complicated watches. When I think of Patek Philippe, I think of high quality in general first, and then I think of technically forward-looking advances in complicated watchmaking second. I don't necessarily think of design primarily when I think of Patek Philippe, at least not the way that I do with Cartier. And yet there is in Patek Philippe's catalog a watch, the Golden Ellipse, which I think is, I think it's underappreciated right now.
100%.
And I think that it's one of the most drop-dead elegant watches ever to come down the pike. Do you guys think that it has the potential to kind of become, for Patek Philippe, what, say, the Pebble has become for Cartier, or the Crash?
I would say realistically, with the Golden Ellipse, it's such a niche watch that it's going to have trouble pulling itself out from under that reputation. Among other things, they're all solid case backs. That doesn't appeal to the modern collector. They're very simple watches, time only. That doesn't appeal to the modern collector. They are hardcore dress watches, which doesn't seem to be as appealing as it once was. I think when they try to use it as a canvas for rare craft arts, it's at its best. For example, enameling, engraving. That entry in the collection is outstanding, and it's a worthwhile application piece. But I think it's like asking, will Vanishing Point ever be as popular as Gone in 60 Seconds? No, it's a much better movie about car chases than Gone in 60 Seconds. But it's always going to be under the radar. The Ellipse is always going to be beautifully proportioned, beautifully detailed, classically simple, and enduring, because it's been around since 1968,
Right.
which was 3 years before Vanishing Point.
So for me, though, I do think I agree with you on it being a canvas for rare handcrafts. I think that it lends itself to creating beautiful and rare items. And I think that whenever something is scarce, there's going to inherently be demand for the item. And I think when you take the Pebble and the Crash, they're inherently very rare and scarce items, more because they were just not that popular when they were being produced. And when you look at watches today, some of the least popular watches in the past are having their moment now just because you don't see too many, they're rare and they've become in vogue. And so the Ellipse was exceptionally popular, right, for a long time. And so there are many of them out there. And so I think that as far as, and I'm a huge fan of it, so like
Right.
I am hoping it has its moment. Like,
But you would say it's lack of rarity.
I think that
tells
there's
you
an
it's-
overall lack of scarcity that makes it a little bit difficult because there's so many different sizes and combinations, and it's on a bracelet and not on a bracelet, that it makes it a little bit hard. But I do think that any reference can have its moment. And for me, I think over the next year or two, you are going to see the popularity of the Ellipse increase dramatically because of the price point that they can be acquired at. I think that it's still relatively low compared to the rest of the line. And for me, anything that's unique and interesting and recognizable from a distance is important, and it is recognizable from a distance as being a Patek. And I would love to see more. I mean, you have some old school ellipses with lapis dials, onyx dials, and to me, like, bring that back. Like, those are the kinds of watches that I think that could relaunch those references, and I consider that a rare handcraft, right? I mean, that's having a marquetry dial or an enamel dial is no different than having a stone dial to an extent. And so I think that those are the types of things where you can make versions now that are unique and scarce, and give collectors a reason to fight for them.
I think what I really like about Patek is just the sheer range. You can find a simple watch, you can find a very complicated watch, a big watch or a small watch, a sports watch or a dress watch. The back catalog dating back to 1839 is spectacular, so you're not boxed into a modern watch. But you look at some brands, and Roger Dubuis, for example, you've basically got to take it or leave it aesthetic, and you've got to accept that or walk away. Vacheron, if you're not buying an overseas, you are buying a very traditional, very formal, I would say context-constrained type of a dress watch.
Well, they have the historique line.
Audemars Piguet, you've got 90% of the volume and probably 95% of the profit generated by the offshore and the Royal Oak. And then you've got many independents which all have their specialties. But with Patek Philippe, even the 4 watches on the table look nothing alike. There's an incredible diversity, past and present, and I think the depth and the quality combined is what draws me to the brand.
And I mean, I kind of wouldn't want a conversation about Patek Philippe over the last couple of decades to go by without noting some of their technical innovations. I mean, I was in Geneva for the launch of the Grandmaster Chime, and I mean, what an absolute, talk about a watch that nobody asked for. I mean, a watch that includes every single chiming complication and figured out a way to make them even more complex and yet easier to use than ever before. And then let's put them all together in one watch. And by the way, let's have enough surface decoration on it to make it look like a classical or Baroque temple.
Even the most recent advanced research piece that was reported on and then sort of, I would say, not highlighted afterwards, is the acoustic amplifying components in the most recent minute repeater that they launched. And so, which I think perhaps not right now, but you'll definitely see that integrated into future references. But one of the reasons when Tim and I were talking about just how excited we are for you to be on the show was the fact that you've been on both sort of sides of the curtain, right, over the last 20 plus years. And so what I was most interested in hearing was, is there one particular story that you've experienced sort of being on the other side of the curtain, being with the brand, being in Switzerland, or just getting to see it from inside out?
Well, I think of 2 things. One is a very, very short moment that happened between myself and Thierry Stern the year that this watch launched. And, of course, it was the thing that was on everybody's lips at Basel World, and everybody was complaining about it. And I was back at the booth after my sort of formal product introduction meeting, and I ran into Thierry Stern on the stairway, and I said to him, "Geez, Mr. Stern, you've really upset a lot of people with this watch." And he looked at me and sighed, and he said, yeah, everybody comes here and they say, I hate it in the meetings, and then before they leave, they pull me aside and say, can you reserve one for me? And I thought to myself, that if there is a single story that kind of sums up the almost schizophrenic relationship that a lot of Patek enthusiasts have about innovation at Patek Philippe, I think that's it. Heritage is it's a funny thing because everybody expects you to express it. They want to see it. They want to feel it, a tangible sense of connection with the past, especially if your past is a past like Patek's. That's important. And you don't want to seem to be abandoning your own history too much, but at the same time, if you don't take chances And Patek can afford to take chances. They can afford to try things out, I think, at this point. They have the reputation to do it. They have the capacity to do it from a manufacturing standpoint. They certainly have the technical ability to do it. I would like to see them do even more things that absolutely infuriate people when they come out.